Do you ever have a great pairing like oranges and almonds?
Or olives and kale?
And it just makes each part taste different, maybe even better than they would on their own? This is Juxtapose, the podcast where we bring you two tasty pieces of art to see what they're like together.
I'm your host, Bea Forkin.
And I'm Sarah Future. Let's dig in.
All right, so today I'm bringing to the table Maggie Millner's book, Couplets, which has been described as an autobiographical novel told in verse. Here is a brief synopsis. Couplets is a long-form narrative poetry project that explores the journey of a woman in her late 20s living in Brooklyn who leaves a long-term relationship with her boyfriend for another woman who is involved in an open relationship with another writer who eventually leaves her in the end. The book is told through both first and second person, broken into 4 sections with an epilogue and prologue bookending the whole project. The first prologue section is called a proem, and the epilogue section is called a coda. Utilizing mostly rhyming couplets to sustain the entire project, it's also interspersed with short prose vignettes. Her book explores queerness, polyamory, sexual desire as a whole, while also questioning and pushing up against the confines of couplehood. So I read this book when I saw that it was getting a lot of buzz, and I selfishly wanted to read it and study a smallish poetry book put out by a major publishing house to see what the book was accomplishing or attempting to accomplish. At the time, I was meeting virtually with 2 other fantastic writers, and we decided to read the book together. So someone in my writing group, Callie, shout out to Callie, she's an awesome poet, noted that the book really wasn't that risque as it was being touted. That was like her takeaway of the book. And I approached this book with more curiosity than like initial fandom. And I went into the reading experience with like a clean slate of not knowing what to expect and a little bit of skepticism. Though I do have to say I admire the commitment to form and compression of narrative. And the project feels both fresh and the subject is very timely. I've read a couple of interviews with Millner while preparing for this episode, and I was interested in what she had to say about poetry in general. So from an interview with the Paris Review, she's quoted as saying, "But poetry is not a genre, it's a mode. And it's a tradition, and it's a set of formal preoccupations. Formal preoccupations that are also existential preoccupations. In America, in the Library of Congress, or whatever, poetry is a subfield of fiction, which means that the libel laws and things that apply to books that purport to be nonfiction don't apply in the same way to poetry."
So today I'm bringing to the table Ling Ma's short story collection, Bliss Montage, with a focus on the story Oranges, which is the second story in the collection. As a warning, before we get into talking about it, the content of this story may be triggering to some, as we'll be discussing domestic abuse and other themes related to that. So this short story, Oranges, is in first-person perspective of this woman of Asian American heritage who remains unnamed. I'll call her the narrator so that we can keep track of her. But she sees her ex, Adam, on her way home from work and eventually finds herself following him home. Along the way, there's another narrative woven in that eventually sort of converges with the first one about the narrator's conversations and relationship with another of Adam's exes, who tells the narrator about their abusive relationship, this ex and Adam. The narrator also recounts her experiences of being assaulted by Adam prior to their breakup through the narrative. Later shares this information with Adam's current girlfriend, who the narrator meets and talks to at Adam's house, which she follows Adam to. One of the first things that stuck out to me was that social media was also playing a role in this story, and I thought that was especially intriguing since we've talked about social media a few times this season. In this narrative, the narrator posts about what happened to her between her and Adam and gets an outpouring of support, which makes her feel better in some way. And I thought that was a cool overlap with things we've looked at this season. But this time it's sort of a performance of vulnerability versus in Search Party, we talked about sort of like displaying good personhood versus in The Nanny, it's soaking in what is actually bad attention, but attention nonetheless. So this time around, we're thinking really more about the narrator posts on social media divulging information in order to get sympathy about her situation. I thought it was also a cool craft tool to have Oranges be the second story in this collection, but it's actually a retelling of the first story in the collection, which is called Los Angeles, which is also about a woman of Asian American heritage. She has a wing in her house where all of her exes live. It's a much more fantastical telling of the story. One of the exes is named Adam as well, and he has the same sort of characteristics as the Adam that's in Oranges. The narrator in this one, though, takes on a blend of sort of like a protective role where she also wants to be the one to hunt him down in the end. So it's a very like there's a lot of feeling and there's still that chase happening, but it's at the end of the story instead of at the beginning of the story like it is in Oranges. It was a cool way though to have both of these short stories exploring like the same thought that Ling Ma was turning over in her mind. It's almost like that essay idea of like you're thinking through writing. I could see her doing that with these two short stories in exploring the same narrative or the same like concepts in different narrative forms. She also said in an interview with LitHub, quote, both stories, Los Angeles and Oranges, deal with domestic abuse. One is more of a fantastical take on that subject, which I mentioned before. In the other one, it's more of a realist take on domestic abuse. That was my attempt at writing straight up realism, end quote. I thought that it was cool for her to explore fiction into very different ways as well, showing that she can be both a more magical realism writer and a very realistic fiction writer at the same time, and that they can both have the same voice and the same quality of writing that she brings to the table. Speaking of the author herself, I'm going to tell you more about Ling Ma herself. She's actually a professor at U Chicago, which is super cool. She's a Chicago local, and she writes speculative fiction, which combines fantastical elements with everyday elements. Her 2018 debut novel, Severance, won a Kirkus Prize for Fiction, and Bliss Montage is a national bestseller, National Book Critics Circle Award winner, and was on the New York Times Book Review 100 Notable Books of 2022. Her fiction is really freaking good, to say the least, but I particularly found this quote from her about the process of writing from an interview at U Chicago really inspiring. Quote, but I think you should try to guard the writing space as an exploratory space. Keep it safe for yourself and categorize your fears that have to do with reception as publishing questions. She was sort of talking here about thinking about writing and publishing and where do you start to consider your audience and publishing and all that stuff. To continue the quote, give yourself a chance to try it out, work it out, write it out, see what happens. What's the worst thing that could be done? You could always just get rid of the pages. Worst comes to worst. That's the end of that quote. And I see her practicing what she preaches because her work is very exploratory. It goes wherever it needs to go to make its discoveries without fear of being too strange or nightmarish. So I really admire her fiction, and it's definitely influencing my very initial barely scratching the surface attempts at fiction that I've been doing lately as well. So, yeah, that's all.
Cool. I didn't know that you were writing fiction now. That's exciting. So, do you have a personal connection to Ling Ma or this story collection or this particular story?
So, first of all, I had a friend recommend to me Ling Ma. They had read Severance and said that it was really good. So, I already had sort of Ling Ma's name and rattling in the back of my head. And then I was at an abridged bookstore and looking around for things to read. And I find myself gravitating towards short stories quite often because it's something that you can pick up and put down really easily. I get very completionist about things that I read, so I feel like I need to like complete something. Like if it's a novel, I feel like I need to read the whole novel
Yeah,
before I can step away from
totally.
it. Whereas with short stories, I could read a short story and be like, I'll come back to this collection later. So that was something that drew me to this book was that it was full of short stories and also that it was speculative fiction. I've been really drawn to speculative fiction more recently. There's something about having elements that sort of exaggerate the real in a way, or
Hmm.
maybe not even exaggerate it, make the real weird that I
Hmm.
really enjoy. And I think that's something that sort of poetry does too. Maybe we can talk about that in conjunction with Milner's work here, since we are talking about some poetry today. But making the real weird is what I connected with a lot with Ling Ma's writing here. And this particular story I liked the most out of the collection, though there was a runner up that was very close. Let me look at the contents for which one that was. I would say my runner up favorite was Office Hours, which is about this professor who has a magical door in his office and his student who later becomes another professor at the college discovers it and it sort of follows their relationship and that door. And I really enjoyed that one as well. Oranges I really connected with because of there's just some really like visceral visuals in it. Like there is the element of the oranges at one point, but also just the narrator following her natural curiosity and her interactions with the other women characters who are trying to figure out for themselves what do I do with the abuse that I endured and how do I what should I communicate to other women who have been in relationship with this man? I want to like help them in some way. Another thing I really enjoyed about Ling Ma's fiction in general was that it felt very localized. Like the stories are
Hmm.
not big and overarching, they're very contained, self contained. I really like that in fiction because it makes me feel like I can zero in on the details more instead of trying to keep track of a big world that's going on. So I really liked that there were interwoven relationships and there was like a world around the characters, but it really focused on character relationship and character conflict. So I think that covers everything. How about you?
Yeah.
What did
Oh
you
my
connect with
gosh.
in Lingma?
Well, I wanted to say I really appreciated that quote that you brought in where she's talking about her process of writing. And I feel like it comes across in the prose, this just confidence and this like I feel like this is not the right word, but like belief in self almost, or like the belief in the process. It's clear just in the short declarative sentences do a lot of the work of like moving the story forward, which I really appreciated. And then I really liked what you brought up about the social media. And there was a quote that I really liked in the story. Let me find it. I thought of it as, quote, owning my narrative. But as soon as I began owning it publicly, my identity became flattened into this fixed thing. Being a victim was all anyone associated with me. I became a waste bin of unsolicited sympathy. Quietly, I deactivated all my accounts. I really liked that commentary on being a victim and how when you go public with a story in which you've been a victim of something, like people tend to simplify the story or remove your humanity by just making you, oh, you're just a victim. I thought it was like very satisfying read. I liked that the narrator was in pursuit of revenge or like sense of closure, and that is something I really connect with because I've been a victim of things too, and like all I've wanted is kind of revenge in a way, or to have that sense of like knowing that they didn't get away with it and like looking them in the eyes and just being like, I know what you did and you know what you did and you have to look me in the eyes. Like that's something that's like was very satisfying in the reading of it, especially how it ended. That ending was amazing.
Yeah,
Oh, what did
absolutely.
you think of the narrative structure with how she constructed the story?
The structure of this short story also reminded me of Challengers, which
Same.
I
Yeah. That's why I brought it up. I was like, oh, it's like very similar, and then it's kind of like a Pantoum, but this one's
yes, yeah.
a little bit different from the Pantoum.
Yes, but there's the weaving back and forth. I enjoy narrative structures like this that weave back and forth between different moments in time, are not particularly super linear. I find myself writing in that sort of structure as well, of like going back and forth and skipping between things. And I think that the associations that people make are fascinating to see as well. But since this is fiction as well, it's a much better way to like build the structure of the story because you get different things revealed about both the past and the present moment throughout the course of the story, and it does build the narrative arc in a more complex and interesting way. So I enjoyed the narrative structure in this one. I'm trying to think too compared to Los Angeles. Los Angeles was more direct, like it was just linear, kind of started from the beginning and ran all the way through. So I think that's also an interesting contrast between the two, of one sort of goes straight through everything and gets to a conclusion, whereas in Oranges, we're hopping back and forth between what happened before and what's happening in this present moment. What about the narrative structure of Milner's work? How did she approach? Because there is sort of that narrative structure, but there's also the element of it being poetry, having
Right.
lyric moments, that kind of thing.
I feel like, I mean, she was utilizing poetry as a mode. Like she said, that poetry wasn't a genre, it's a mode of, I guess, telling or sharing something. And this was a long form project, and she structured it with those like rhyming couplets, and then she interspersed it with these vignettes that would sort of offer commentary on what was unfolding in the couplets. But I feel like it was a pretty straightforward, arc of you saw the couple, you saw the inciting incident, you saw the tension rising, and then it fell. So I know you had a question about her choice to include both first person and second person.
Oh, so there was a quote from one of the prose poems where she really gets very philosophical, theoretical about what she's actively writing. And she says, I'll read the quote and then we can talk through it. Quote, occasionally it occurred to you that it might be better to write the account in the second person, truer to the spirit of that time. You no longer felt that experiences belonged to people in the first place. They were always the outcome of forces beyond the strictly personal, and only became art at the moment they were made available, if in an altered form, to someone new. The trouble was that you were also embodied, which meant that you could never quite transcend yourself or evacuate the frame or shirk the myth of the grammatical singular. So, what did you think about that discussion of the second person perspective in her poems? It doesn't flow across all of the poems, but there were particular ones that were in that second person.
So at first, I was confused by it. And then actually, I was confused by the opening section, the proem, and then the closing thing, coda. I had to look those terms up. I didn't know that those were literary devices that introduce a work and then close the work. Coda, I literally thought it stood for codependency because CODA stands for Codependency is Anonymous. I was like, oh, she is she referencing that really this is a journey away from codependency? Like I literally didn't know what a coda was. So anyway, so I thought it was confusing. But then the proem, which is like the intro of the book, I felt like did the work of introducing the singular I because she literally opens the book with I became myself. I became myself. No, I always was myself. There's no such person as myself. So I feel like the book is like introducing this idea of the I, of becoming an I or becoming a me, like initially. So those philosophical ideas are being presented there at the very beginning. And then utilizing the couplet form is also doing a lot of the philosophical work. But I think adding the you to the book added to the reading experience in another layer. Did you have an opinion about it?
Based on what she was saying in that prose poem I was just reading from, too, she felt that sometimes she needed to distance herself more
Mm.
from what she was writing about or to even like externalize what was going on because at times clearly it was very painful. She's going through this process of breaking up with someone that she still really loves and cares for and trying to understand this version of herself where she's outside of that relationship and also exploring queerness and all of that. I felt like incorporating the second person made sense where she wanted to. But also, I felt that having a whole prose poem discussing why she was doing that, I kind of wish she hadn't done that. Because for me, I don't like very much when people try to explain what they're doing or their reasoning or their intent behind things. Like
Mm.
let me just let your art wash over me and I'll understand what I do from it. And I do often think about the like second person perspective. If I ever write in it, I'm thinking about how being in the reader's shoes would feel reading that specifically of they're going to start thinking about themselves being in my shoes. I think readers are smart enough to be aware of the fact that you're doing that on purpose, and it'll make them feel something different than if you are saying I to them. You know what I
Mm.
mean?
Yeah. I feel like the form of this whole project was constantly calling attention to itself as artifice or like the whole process of like writing about personal experiences. It's like was constantly being called attention to. And so the thing that you're saying about vulnerability of these like painful experiences, like I kind of felt removed from them, if that makes any sense, because of it was too self-aware, I guess. The writing was too self-aware.
I'm
Like
looking
I
at some
didn't
of my
feel
other
the
questions.
emotional pain in the same way that I felt the emotional pain in Ling Ma's story.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's sort of like the action of intellectualizing your experiences or trauma or what you are feeling about things. Intellectualizing your feelings is what she does in the poems that she writes here. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I get what you're saying. And I guess for me, that felt sometimes, I think that's where it led me to start feeling like it felt pretentious in a way
Hmm.
because Milner seems to have constructed it to feel like it's displaying that artifice or tapping into that artifice as a way to say something in particular. It felt pretentious to me because she was over explaining a lot of the things and over explaining that artificial approach. But I don't know. Did it make any
Yeah.
sense when I started to say that I thought it felt a little pretentious?
Yeah. Um, so from preparing for this episode, I like read different interviews and like watched some videos, and I know that those prose sections came later. I feel like the entire project is a little pretentious, and I don't know if like that was like her intention. Sometimes I don't know if like people who are pretentious like intend to be that way. Like sometimes they do. It's you know what I mean? But like I know from her educational background, like she went to Brown, that's like an Ivy League school, and then she went to NYU like right after for her MFA in poetry. So she spent a lot of her life in these pretentious spaces that are known for being exclusive to the majority of the population. She spent a lot of her life like studying and reading like literary work and like creating, studying, and discussing literary arts specifically, or maybe even like all of the arts, is one of privilege. And it's one of privilege, especially for reading, because it's asking people to give up a lot of their time and attention to engage with something, and time isn't always available to people. I watched an amazing video with, not with, but by Ocean Vuong where he was discussing this. Like in the video, he like was talking about his family and how his family could never even possibly dream of reading a novel. Like that was something that they would never do because a lot of the people in his family worked long, tough service jobs and they just didn't have that. So, anyway, she's very privileged, I guess is what I'm saying. So, I liked some of the philosophical parts in her book because like I could learn something new, especially when she was talking about like Willa Cather. I read Willa Cather's books like when I was a teenager. So I was like, oh, Willa Cather, like I like those. I thought it was an effective choice for her to structure the book, including those vignettes, only because it just, you know, offered another kind of like palate cleansing while you're reading these rhyming couplets. I think that could be very overbearing to read an entire book like that. So I don't know if she felt compelled to show the reader, like, oh, look at me, I'm actually really smart. Let me show you how smart I am in these prose sections to demonstrate like how high level she was approaching rhyming couplets. I say that because people who aren't at all familiar with poetry understand in the most like general of ways that a poem rhymes, and a rhyming couplets can have like a Hallmark card kind of vibe. And maybe she wanted to distance herself from, you know, an Instagram poet that she's like, oh, I'm very studied and like it's my study of form that is why I'm utilizing it. I don't know. Those are just like my ideas of why she, pure speculation of why she would approach the book structure in that way. But yeah, I feel like she should have just let the couplets kind of let the work speak for itself.
Yeah, definitely. I think the prose pieces could have had a home elsewhere as well, like especially, you know, giving interviews with people about couplets. She could have brought some of those thoughts into those interviews or, you know, published elsewhere in like micro essay type places, like, and then had sort of work that is in multiple places, but it's not distracting from each other at the same time. I think a lot of poets end up actually writing things like that because sometimes you are just thinking through what you're trying to say and do your best thinking through writing, kind of like we were
Right.
talking about before with Ling Ma, of, you know, that
Yes.
process of like writing as thinking.
Mhm.
So I see her doing her like writing as thinking in those prose poems, but the best place maybe for that is not necessarily right with the collection of couplets. Maybe it's elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And like this is a major publishing house that published the book. And so it could have been like a suggestion from an editor too, like, hey, maybe do this, maybe explain it to the everyday everyday reader, whatever. So
Yeah. Yeah.
going back to oranges, do you have a favorite scene?
I'm trying to find where the orange like falls off the table or something. Like that is stuck in my brain, but I can't remember where it is exactly.
It's toward the beginning.
The
A
basket of oranges. Yeah.
Yeah, and the orange costs 2.98.
Which seemed like a lot for an orange.
I know, or maybe it was perfectly reasonable. I love those moments in the story.
So yeah, I would say that that scene closer to the beginning where the narrator meets Adam for the last time before Christine contacts her. I'm trying to figure out how to say this best. But the narrator decides to catch up with Adam at sort of like an upscale gourmet market with a seating area. And there was just something about this scene with the orange and I think it's the everyday sort of like mundane detail of the orange that really sticks in my brain, because we talk about this in poetry too, of having those like mundane details are something that really ground a poem. And I would love to hear if you noticed a moment or two of this at all in Milner's work as well. But that moment with the orange, and then the orange like rolls off the tray onto the floor, and they can't find the orange later. It's just,
Yes.
there's something, so that is like one of those moments where Ling Ma's sort of like speculative fiction brain really brings something to the table for this fiction piece, is that there's an air of mystery, and also like it feels foreboding, and like there's a foreshadowing of that these characters are going to, they've already impacted each other's lives, but they're going to end up, it's going to end up weird at the end, which it does, of just sort of like
Yes.
things falling apart and you don't really know where to go from there, kind of thing.
Yeah. I thought the orange scene was really effective in setting up, I think, the themes too of like they both witnessed this thing happening. They can't find it, and like they keep like questioning reality. And I feel like that's how the story ends too, where she's like, wait, did this really happen? Um,
Like my life is just normal now, but like it wasn't for a second. And
yeah.
how do I how can both of those things be true?
Yes.
It feels like it's hard to consolidate the crazy things that can happen in life and the normalcy of life too. But did you notice any of that in Milner's work at all? The mundane details, or, the
Oh my
weirdness of
gosh.
life also at the same time as the normalcy of life?
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, like just yeah, the all of the details of the relationship unfolding and the ending. The ending was like so crazy in that it was like all of a sudden you sally forth practicing your Kegels. It was like just that like random moment of her just like what? That part like made me laugh because it seemed like
Yeah, it's
kind of
weird. It's
yeah.
like weird and also like a mundane thing somehow.
Yeah, just like the naming of that, especially like in how it ended the book too. Yeah, and I think she's at a park. She's looking at a lake or something. The children on the swing set making the exact sound of humanity. Yeah, I feel like she does that a lot in her poems. I was thinking about how they overlapped, or maybe they didn't overlap, and I saw some similarities. Both were commenting on toxic masculinity and patriarchy, fascism. I know comes up in like a couple of Milner's poems, or at least she may have one poem about it. And I feel like the collection as a whole of Bliss Montage is commenting on that toxic masculinity, maybe not fascism. I think both books are obsessed with relationships, the complexity of them. Milner does not touch on abuse or how abuse factors into relationships. Ma does. Attachments to others can be difficult to break even in the face of abuse. And the books are very different, though. They're so very different. Ma allows the narrative and writing to introduce philosophical questions, whereas Milner really does show her hand in the philosophical scaffolding. Both books are concerned with 20s and 30s young people finding themselves, navigating relationships. The nature of a short story collection is that it can examine many different angles of a relationship or stories. And Milner's book is really focused on the narrator and her journey, finding herself amidst relationships to others.
There was also a moment too in Milner's collection where she talks about her new relationship with a woman, which leads her out of her long-term relationship with a man. And that relationship seemed quite toxic, the way that she talked about it. So there was a little overlap there of like exploring toxic relationships, though with Ling Ma, it's like very clear that, you know, this character is abusive towards this other character. And we understand that clearly. Whereas in Milner's poems, because they feel so like actively in the moment of like, I'm not sure what to do with this, like what's going on here, it's less clear as to like, okay, is this relationship like hurting her? Like, is it not going well? Like, what are
Yeah.
the toxicity levels?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I was like, wait,
Yeah.
is this a healthy relationship? Like, that's when I saw the Coda thing and I didn't know what it was. I was like, oh, are these like really unhealthy relationships? And like, she doesn't know how to have healthy and loving relationships. Yes, like, which I don't know. Like, was the relationship healthy? Like, it seemed like very like fantasy based and like obsessive, the one with the woman. It
Yes.
was like, what is
Yeah.
this actually based on? Like, is this love? Is it just pure infatuation?
And that might not have been something that Milner discovered this time around in writing this overarching narrative. But I appreciate that when there's like not super clear cut and dry answers. And I like that we've paired them together here of having one where it's like exploring what does it feel like to be in these relationships where you're unsure, like, is this a good thing for me? Whereas Ling Ma leads us to the discoveries of like how these people get through to the other side of seeing, okay, this was not good for me and I'm out on the other side, but now like it still has had its impact on me, and how do I actually move forward from that? Okay, one random little question that I didn't write down at all, but I want to
Okay.
record it for my
Yes.
personal
Oh,
records.
do it.
What do you think about rhyming in poetry?
You know what? I love a good rhyme. Okay, like my poetry doesn't rhyme. Though so actually sometimes it'll accidentally rhyme, you know, and like when it kind of happens organically, I feel like, you know, a good rhyme I think can work really well. Like I listen to a ton of rap music and I love the musicality of a rhyme. So,
You heard it here first.
yeah, tell me, are you against it? I don't think I've actually read any rhymes in your
I think
poems.
it, yeah, I think I also, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen organically. I do not set the intention to write couplets that rhyme like Milner has done in couplets. And yeah, I struggle with liking it. I
Yeah.
struggle with liking it. I often feel a little bit pushed out because it just reminds me so much of like nursery rhymey stuff.
Yeah.
And like we've had such a long journey with rhyme in poetry that it feels more interesting and engaging to explore how rhyme can function outside of like the more traditional
Hmm.
uses that we've had for it. So, but I do my best to keep an open mind
I know. I know.
as much as possible. But sometimes it gets to me and I'm like, I think it's too because I have like read and judged like high schooler poetry before. And it just,
I know. It's so heavy-handed. That's the thing. It's like, come on, man. Like, can you reveal this another way?
yeah, yeah. And I worry sometimes too that it will trip up the poet and that they won't be able to express things the way that feels most natural and true to what they want to be saying because they're trying to follow a rhyming scheme, you know?
Yeah. I feel like on the flip side of it, though, it can challenge somebody to distill what they're actually going to say. And it can actually, if they're like working in a very constrained form,
Yeah.
which could be a rhyming scheme if that's the form you're working in, it can hatch open something new, but it can
Yes.
also, yeah, it can go either way. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm with you on it. It's
Good.
like, I don't write in that way.
Thank you for listening to today's episode about Ling Ma's short stories and Maggie Millner's poetry, specifically couplets. Please check out our website at the link in the description for more information about this episode. If you have any feedback or a pairing you're just dying for us to talk about, please send us a message over on our website, or you can find us at Juxtapose Podcast on Instagram. Please join us again in a couple weeks for an episode about Adrian Piper, who's a conceptual artist, and poet Emily Goldstein. We're going to look at one poem from them, and they are a local Chicago poet, so I'm really excited to discuss them. That's all. We'll see you in a couple weeks.